Okay, so we're on the third skills of this semester, the third skills video. The third skill is scientific writing part one. So there's three parts to this in this semester. Some of you come into this course with more experience in scientific writing, and some of you come in with less, and that's all fine, right? We just need to get to a point where we can do it. This particular section is called Anatomy of an Article because its goal is to get us more aware of the pieces of research and how that relates to the things we've already been working on. Okay. Um, so let's zoom out slightly and talk in terms of the definition, in some sense, of scientific writing. People who study writing don't necessarily look at it as its own category, but the people who do it do. Okay. So my first question is, what is scientific writing and why does it matter? So-called scientific writing is a subgenre of academic writing. Okay. Academic writing is simply writing produced through scholarly work. And you might think, well, that's obvious, of course. But as a result, it doesn't look like other types. The particulars of academic writing depend on the field, right? And that includes scientific writing. It includes the particulars, just the conventions and the style and the information and the formatting that are specific to scientists and the way that we go. And in fact, linguistics within it has sort of the way a syntactician writes their articles looks different from the way an SLAer often does, right? So these things end up mattering. In this class, the version that we are kind of working on is SLA-ish because it's kind of it converges a lot on any sort of experimental approach, quantitative experimental approach to linguistics. So it's related to that piece. This course, if you're not already aware, has syncs up to some degree with Linguistics 490, which is a capstone course for anyone in the speech language pathology or general linguistics tracks, and anyone who takes 400 level is welcome to take. And so the information and the things we practiced here feed into that course to some degree. You can take it without taking 317 as people have, but it is easier to take 317 after this course. Not specifically because of the SLA component, but this other stuff, these skills, okay? So we are kind of focusing on what would be considered experimental quantitative approaches to linguistics. That's kind of the style that we're coming in on. Now, all academic writing requires assessing and citing appropriate sources, using stylistic conventions, as I said, and clear and concise writing that contributes to the field. Assessing and citing appropriate sources you may have done in other courses, like English, for example, courses like writing, like 101 and stuff, because there are conventions that show up in those fields, but they are not the same as we do. They are not. And if you do citations and things like that, in this course, as if it's English 101, you will be wrong, okay? We will practice this. Actually, there are a couple skills sections that are about the format that we're going to use, which is called APA, right? But it matters, right? Within this, we'll discuss a little bit about stylistic conventions and clear and concise writing. Those things are a little bit beyond what we're doing this semester for various reasons, but we will talk somewhat about them. You won't be tested on them per se. But the thing about assessing and citing appropriate sources, we will talk about that in a little more detail. Okay, so as I said, the particular flavor of scientific writing for this course is a journal article in linguistics, particularly quantitative methods. Our sources that we use when we use them have to be peer-reviewed. This includes articles, it includes book chapters in some cases, and the stylistics, as I said, are APA, the American Psychological Association, because psychology is a cousin genre of linguistics. It's not the same, but it has things in common with us. We also butt elbows with like philosophy and sociology and a few other fields, right? So we kind of rub elbows with other stuff, and stylistically, we often borrow from psychology, okay? The clear, concise writing that we are doing in this, I mentioned it before, is we're going to emphasize trying to use constructs, and I know that we're still working on mastering doing that, some of us, which is fine. I have this in my mind as that we're going forward. But knowing where they are and how they fit into the writing is going to be really important because otherwise sometimes we kind of meander and don't kind of keep ourselves together, okay? Now, expectations for this component of the course. As I said, there's scientific writing 1, 2, and 3 as part of our skills sequence. In fact, the very last skills is scientific writing part 3. What I'm looking for is for you to show me that you've acquired the skills that go into this, okay? Being an online course, it's really hard for me to do the hands-on mentorship that's involved with writing a long-term research, well, writing a research piece that we normally do in this class. It's really hard for me to effectively mentor everyone if I'm not face-to-face with you. So for this semester, we're doing it via skills. You will be doing writing on the assessments as you would do anytime I offer this course. So these skills will matter there, okay? So the writing skills that we're practicing, I do expect to show up whenever I ask you to, for example, imagine that I asked you to assess Q1, right? On an assessment, I say, okay, tell me the positions and tell me which one's the best supported, like we did in class, except for as a content assessment, except for now that we're learning about constructs, we're learning about hypotheses and stuff like that, I'm expecting to see some of those influences in your writing, okay? So I expect to see progression in the particular skills that we've practiced. And of course, as I said, awareness of how constructs or research questions, etc., relate to this. Okay, so anatomy of an article. So a research article is a publication of, in linguistics, we're talking 30 pages is a very typical length, which has certain parts consistently across various journals. Again, we're talking about quantitative type approaches. There are other things, right? Some people just spend an entire article talking about a syntactic theory. Those aren't quantitative, so it kind of lives in a different universe of anatomy, let's say. So here, this is what we're going to see in an experimental article. You'll often get an abstract beginning. Best case scenario you do because they're very important. But then you'll get an intro, a literature review, also called a review of literature for no particular reason that they have two orders, but whatever. And literature review is when we talk about previous studies that have studied things related to our current questions, okay? The methods, the results, and the discussion and conclusion. For those of you who are going to move on to Linguistics 490, the methods and the results section are the emphasis of that course. We are talking a little bit more in this course with things like lit review and kind of global stuff. Okay, but methods and results will be an emphasis of that course. We'll talk a little about it, but it's kind of in the future for most of you if you're taking that course. All right, so constructs in the anatomy of the article, I just listed out the parts. The constructs are going to appear and appear and appear. So a typical article primarily is concerned with 2 to 3 constructs on average. Now, as we've said, it is possible to go, well, I guess this thing over here, proficiency, let's use for an example, because it's such a broad thought. Proficiency relates in some loose sense to everything I'm doing here. Well, it's probably not specifically what I'm testing in any given article because it's such a broad thing. It's hard to draw conclusions. It's hard to even test, honestly. So we're talking about constructs that will feature in the research question that we can measure and that we will draw conclusions about, okay? So, you know, we started out broad and understanding what a construct was, and now we have to hone in on what is relevant, okay? So on average, any article really truly is concerned with 2 to 3, okay? And this is because that's how many you honestly can stuff into a research question. Now the intro, we see that piece, we're going to introduce the constructs, right? As part of a larger problem in the field. We have to motivate our research, so we need to present a problem, okay? And so in that intro, we go, oh gosh, someone should really study input, right? And how much that affects uptake. Remember, uptake was when the learner gets a feedback and then actually fixes what they've done wrong. So, you know, someone said, we should really study this, and this is why, okay? This is the intro. I introduce the constructs, and I tell you why you should care, right? The lit review is discuss what we know about the constructs, right? Previous research on it. So if I'm talking about input and uptake, I go, well, there's a whole bunch of stuff on input and there's some stuff on uptake, and this is what they found, right? And the idea is that once I've reviewed what exists, I've literally reviewed the literature, I end on a research question or a hypothesis, because why would I do a study that's already been done unless I'm explicitly replicating, which we're not talking about right now. But why would I do a study that's already been done? What is the purpose? The idea is to go through the literature and find what hasn't yet been conclusively answered, either because two studies contradict each other, or there's a hole, or no one's thought of it, or, oh, that's rare. Be very careful with that. Usually someone's thought of something adjacent, and if you say this hasn't been studied, you make people angry. Not always, but sometimes. Anyway, so the idea is to go through the existing literature and kind of land on something that hasn't yet been studied. And therefore, the end of the lit review is a very normal place to find a research question and or the hypotheses. And not everyone will write both. There's a question sometimes of preference or stylistics, you know. After that, we jump into the methods. A lot of times there we're detailing operationalizations of the constructs. Well, I'm going to test input in terms of hours of exposure, and I'm going to test uptake in terms of the number of times out of opportunities they fixed it. Uptake's a pretty easy one. But you'll see that in the methods. I'll tell you what tasks I'm doing, how I'm coding it, which is the operationalization piece, so that when I look at the results, you know what I did. And so obviously the results follow that. I present what was found, I evaluate the research questions or hypotheses. It's a very typical thing to do in the results to go, okay, so this was the research question and my results support it, right? You go, I found this, my research question was this, and therefore it supports it. Or I found this, my research question was this, and it didn't. I have to reject the hypothesis or whatever. Right? That's usually how that works. And so because research questions and hypotheses feature constructs, in essence, the construct has reappeared. You'll notice I keep bolding things, right? Construct, research question or hypothesis, constructs, research question or hypothesis, because it's got to be threaded through. Because otherwise, why are we writing an article to begin with, right? And so the discussion, we interpret the findings with respect to what's known about the constructs, right? So if in order to, again, I've operationalized it as relationship between quantity of input in terms of hours of listening to the language or seeing the language or whatever, and like number of times they fixed it, my results might be that there's a correlation. The more hours you're exposed, the more likely you'll fix it or whatever. And so that would be my result. There's a correlation. And I go back and I say, is there a relationship? And I say, yes. And so when I go to my discussion, I go, okay, previous research didn't study this relationship. So since we know that input's good and uptake tends to mean we've learned, then it seems like since the reason why input's good might be because it causes us to learn things and we see it in uptake, whatever. So this is what we're trying to do in the discussion. We go back. What did we learn about the constructs before? What's known? This is what I found in my study, and this is how it goes back together, okay? So again, thread, 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 okay? Hypothetical example. Has to do, I invented this and has nothing to do with SLA because I think it's kind of clear, okay? So let's imagine a researcher wants to do a study about the relationship between personality type and color of car the person buys, okay? And this particular person goes out into the world and finds there are 4 papers on this, right? 2 of these papers suggest that people with outgoing personalities prefer bright colors. One says red specifically, but the other one just bright. They differ in that the red claim is only made for new cars and the bright claim is made for people using used cars. You don't have to memorize the details, just kind of get a sense of what I'm saying. In the other 2 papers, one claims that all people choose bright colors, but the author's methods of only asking 3 people is kind of suspect. The 4th paper suggests people who are introverted don't like to pay extra money for colors like red and baby blue, which almost always cost more in new cars. That's actually true, if you didn't know that. This is why my car is black, but it's fine. Okay, so what are the constructs here? I'll give you a hint. There's a research question, and they always have it. Okay, so if you didn't already realize it, it's literally just personality type and color of car. all these other details are things like, so this is kind of the lit review kind of section, written loosely. But we're seeing the operationalizations, right? Personality type, it looks like we have outgoing and introverted. It looks like those are the two big ones that they've used so far. Color of car, we've got bright, we've got not bright, we've got red, we've got baby blue. These are all operationalizations, ways of measuring it, okay? So the constructs are literally just this level, because then we have to dive down deep. Because if we're too specific on those constructs, right, if they don't cover, again, the thing specifically I'm trying to study, and it must be that, okay? If I get too specific, so if I try to say that the construct is red cars, I'm not going to see a relationship between red and baby blue, or red and bright, or even if I try to say bright is the construct, then I don't have a relationship between bright and not bright, right? So again, you have to find out what is the top level of the thing that you're measuring, okay? But stick to what is the purpose of the paper, okay? All right. So again, if I were to write a paper on this, the intro would be, I'm going to introduce car colors and personality. They're often used independently in the field of marketing, as if we were doing marketing, without understanding the relationship. That's a problem, right? I don't know how they relate, but they both get talked about a lot. The lit review, we talked about those 4 papers that do not exist. I invented them. We know something about car color, that people talk about bright and not bright cars, and personality, that there's some things by introverts and extroverts. And then we end on this on a research question, which I think I put in the next slide. I'm not sure anymore, but maybe it's what it says here. The methods, detail operationalization, the car color and personality type. So in this particular study, maybe I'm going to say bright is these 6 colors, including red and baby blue, and not bright is everything else. I don't know. Maybe I'll use like a infrared camera and tell you how much light reflects off of it. I don't know. And then research, present what was found. So maybe I also found that bright colors above a certain, everything in the blue and red range cost more, and yes, the extroverted people liked it or something. And then I discussion, I go back to, well, this is what I found. These are what those previous studies found, and so this is what I think is happening, okay? Again, interpret the findings with respect to what is known about car colors and personalities. Now, if you were paying attention, my previous anatomy, where it mentioned construct, research question, is basically this, except for I've substituted constructs with car colors and personality. And I mean, a research question is a research question. It's to show back up. Okay, but that's the idea. Thread, 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 thread. Okay, so I didn't include the research question. It's not important. It's probably something like, is there a relationship between car color and personality? Okay, so abstracts in particular is something that we see from time to time in this course, okay? Abstracts are the TLDR of the research world, and if you don't know what TLDR means, it means too long didn't read, okay? Seriously, and I'm not kidding at all, is that if people are trying to evaluate whether they should read an article because they may need to cite it, they will pretty much read the abstract. Now, they're really dedicated, they might scan the rest of the paper too, but I mean, there are so many papers you could read. You do have to pick them, right? And you will read the abstract first. Now, as a result, everything that's important in the articles mentioned in the abstract, like truly important, right? So everything's mentioned, as I say here, albeit without the supporting evidence or the argumentation. Okay, so a lot of times it's really sparse of the reasoning. You still need to read it. But you know what they're claiming at the very least and why they are interested in it. So it's a fast way, the abstracts are a fast way to figure out what constructs, so what are they studying, right? What's important in this thing? And potentially the research question, although not usually the hypothesis. It's something like, we asked blah, 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 right? As opposed to, we predicted. Sometimes you'll see that, but not usually. Okay? And so, yeah, as a result, it essentially contains all the parts, the problem / intro, the previous findings / lit review, the methods, the results, discussion, conclusion. Okay, so abstracts in that way are really useful for practicing this on a micro scale. So let's do one real quick, okay? We're going to read this together out loud, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. The quiz is a little easier than this, but I always like to go a little harder when we're together and ever so slightly easier when you're alone, okay? The idea is, maybe we'll all feel, understand that we know things and not feel like we're floundering for unnecessary reasons. Okay, Sons and Morgenstern. I can't remember if I edited this slightly or not, but this is their abstract, okay? Take a breath. I will read it out loud. If you are better with listening than reading, just listen to my voice. If my voice is distracting, pause and read it yourself, okay? The facilitative role. Facilitative means helps. Okay, the helpful role. The facilitative role of explicit information, and explicit is things that you can state out loud, like when you're first learning to drive a car, you know where the stick shift and stuff is, right? The facilitative role of explicit information, second language acquisition, right? The helpfulness of things you can say out loud, or explanations, or instruction, in fact, has been supported by a significant body of research, and there's references in the original that I don't include here, but counter evidence is also available. This experimental study investigates the effects of computer-delivered explicit information on the acquisition of Spanish word order by comparing 4 groups comprised of combinations of plus-minus explanation and plus-minus explicit feedback, okay? The word order isn't that terribly important, right? But they made 4 groups. One group both got instruction, explanation of this grammar point they were doing. And they got feedback on whether they were doing it right or wrong. Another group got the explanation and no feedback. One group got no explanation but only feedback, like, hey, can you do this thing? Oh, that's wrong, try it again. It's always the funniest one to me. And then there's one that got neither explanation nor feedback. They're kind of the control group like that. You just do it. Who knows what'll happen, okay? Okay, so again, let me read the sentence again now that you know what those combinations are. This experimental study investigates the effect of computer-delivered explicit information, so explanation or feedback, on the acquisition of Spanish word order by comparing 4 groups comprised of plus-minus explanation, plus-minus explicit feedback. Okay, so we know what we're doing. Again, the homework is easier than this. Okay. Results showed that all groups improved significantly, so all combinations, and this is pre and after, right? So they tested them at 2 different times. All groups improved significantly and similarly on the interpretation and production tasks. So they had to interpret some sentences for meaning, and they had to produce some sentences using this target form. It is suggested that explicit information may not necessarily facilitate second language acquisition. So me explaining grammar to you or giving you feedback might not actually help you. And everyone's going, but this is a study that supports that finding, right? May not necessarily facilitate second language acquisition, and that exposing learners to task essential practice is sufficient to promote acquisition. Okay, and we'll revisit explicit information instruction at some point, but that's what this one found. Okay, what are the constructs in this abstract? Okay, so pause if you need to. Okay. So I honestly think that the way that this abstract is framed is really one major construct, and it is in fact explicit information. You know, it's not like they're looking at explicit information by proficiency level, or they're looking at it by age of acquisition, or proficiency or explicit information compared to implicit information, or any of those things, right? So to some degree, the only major construct here, right, which is kind of unusual, is explicit information. So then if I ask you how is this operationalized, you can kind of go about this 2 ways. I would say the most obvious one is to operationalize explicit information as explanation and explicit feedback, right? This would be the best way to go about it. I will mention, however, there is some information here on the coding / further information operationalization in the following sentence. So results, so they're talking about improving on an interpretation or production task. So this is sort of the full operationalization, right? So it's, you know, it really has to do with performance. So it's sort of the dependent variable here, right? But it does tell you something about how it's being measured, okay? So it's sort of an amplification on the methods and the operationalization and the coding, frankly. Okay, coding is how you record the data in a way to later analyze. You can see how that's almost exactly the same as operationalization. And for you guys, it don't have to be different. It's fine, okay? All right, so thus far, what is the research question as far as we know, okay? And it's this. The experimental study investigates the effects of, so it's not framed as a question, but this is, what is the effect of, it's pretty broad, right? What's the effect of explicit information on the acquisition of Spanish word order? You could frame it also as, is it helpful? Does type matter? Like those are questions you could frame it into that. But in the abstract, you could something very, very broad, I would say, on average. And so how did you respond to the research? How did the authors respond to the research question is basically this. Explicit information may not necessarily facilitate second language acquisition because of the findings switched in between there, right? Okay, yes? All right, so this is a slightly more higher level abstract. So you can kind of see the major construct is explicit information. Its operationalization has to do with explanation/instruction and explicit feedback, right? The research question, therefore, asks about the role of explicit information. And the finding was that it didn't really help because the performance was similar across the groups that had explicit and didn't. Okay? All right, if you have specific questions about this, let me know. Like I said, something like this is on the homework. It's just not quite as challenging as this, okay? Yes? Awesome.